Welcome to the Capstone Conversation, where you learn about what's happening in the greater East Bay. I am your host, Jared Asch. On today's episode, we are going to talk about powering the East Bay. We are joined by PG&E's Jake Ziggleman. He is the Vice President for the Bay Area region, which, if you're seeing his YouTube background, includes Contra Costa, Alameda, San Francisco, and San Mateo counties. Jake, welcome. Tell us a little bit more about yourself and your tenure at PG&E.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. You nailed the counties. I'm the Vice President for the Bay Area region at PG&E. We have 5 regions. The Bay Area is one of them. I just passed 18 years at PG&E, so I've worn a number of hats in a number of different departments across the company. Stepped into this role back in February and excited to be here with you. My role is essentially a bit of a general manager for all things PG&E in my region.
We're going to cover a lot of topics today: economic development, safety, power demands. But let's start first with, what is PG&E's vision for the future? Where does the utility want to go? How do they want to evolve and continue to serve California?
Yeah, it's a really good question, Jared. If we're talking about the electric grid, 2 things come to mind. We need to make sure that our grid is well positioned to support the clean energy transition and accommodate the realities of climate change and be more climate resilient. We are at a unique inflection point in the energy industry right now. We have several powerful forces converging all at once. On the one hand, we have an electric grid largely built in the post-World War II boom years, in some cases even before that. We have a grid that's decades old, in some cases approaching 100 years old, that needs some infrastructure renewal. And we're in that natural process of rebuilding that grid that was largely built in those post-World War II boom years. That's powerful force number one. Number 2 is the realities of climate change. We have never experienced sustained winds and gusts like we have in recent years. We've seen the devastation of Hurricane Helene on the East Coast in the last few weeks, and the widespread outages and impacts on the electric system. And then we have unprecedented load growth on the electric side, load growth that we really have not seen for decades in California, load growth that we've not experienced in any of our professional lifetimes, that presents both a challenge, but also an amazing opportunity for what we do with the grid. Dealing with those 3 converging forces and making sure that our grid is well positioned to deal with the realities of climate change and also support that clean energy transition is really where we're headed. And having a grid that is fit for purpose, as we call it. We're in that process now. It's going to take a decent amount of investment, but it means looking at our design standards and ensuring that our poles are strong enough to deal with those climate realities, covered conductor that's strong enough to deal with those climate realities, rethinking how we deal with protection devices, knowing that we're going to have more distributed energy resources on the grid that are sending bidirectional power flow, and the protection schemes need to accommodate that. Thinking through more sectionalizing devices so we can create isolation zones and allow communities to have their own microgrids, right, which supports that clean energy transition. There's some real opportunities right now and on the horizon as we think through how we reinvest in this grid that is approaching decades, if not 100 years old in many cases.
A lot of things to take away in there. And it leads me, the first one I'll start with before we dive into climate change is the load growth. You talked about unprecedented load growth, and that's hammered some of the areas in PG&E territory for economic development. In Hayward, I know there was an issue that a Rivian manufacturing plant, we lost out to Denver area because they couldn't get enough power to do their needs. In Vacaville, which I know is outside of your territory, they want to get in a tech center, and to do that, they need more power than they can get in the next 10 years, they're saying. Talk a little bit about, where is this load growth coming from? How do we accommodate that? I know there's housing elements and more pieces to it.
Yeah, it's a great question. Our load growth forecast between now and about 2040 suggests that we're going to experience about 70% load growth. But the really interesting companion to that is that while we're expecting to see 70% load growth overall, cumulative volume of electricity demand, we're forecasting only about a 17%. So that's maybe a little overly precise, but call it between 15 and 20% peak demand growth. That tells you the amount of load shifting and advanced load management strategies that we have built into that forecast to help mitigate that peak. You can imagine what that unmitigated load growth of 70% would require of the grid versus what a more managed 17% peak demand is going to require of the grid. If you think about the way that grid design has traditionally gone, we need to rethink that traditional grid design. It's designed to that peak demand plus a bit of margin. If we can manage that peak demand, even if we're seeing substantial volumetric load growth, we're in a much healthier position. It requires less overall infrastructure investment, which is borne by all of us as customers over the next several years. We have a fair amount to do. And one of the bigger challenges that we're dealing with in the energy industry right now is how do we manage that infrastructure investment into the grid in a way that balances affordability and the impacts on rates. If we can really mitigate that peak demand, that's the key to manageable investment infrastructure and manageable affordability over the long term. In fact, we see a path to being able to make these infrastructure investments in a way that helps decarbonize the economy, creates a more resilient grid, and by way of this load growth, it will actually reduce the unit cost of energy over time. And so that's a winning combination in the long term. Of course, we need to execute on it. But the load growth is really driven by three main things. Electric vehicles, that's the big one. Building electrification, and to a more recent extent, the emergence of AI and data center growth. Those are the three big categories.
On AI, here's an interesting stat that came up on a previous episode. A regular Google search would take one light bulb for about 3 seconds worth of power. Using AI, that same search will be 30 light bulbs for about 3 hours. It was a substantial change in the amount of energy we're using. As you're going forward with these strategies, how do you help account for more housing, more data centers, more EVs, and economic growth? How do you help everybody plan ahead so we're not losing those businesses based on power?
It's a really good question. Something important to keep in mind here is that the way we do our planning and forecasting, especially when it comes to demand, is through our rate case cycles. And those are done 3 years in advance. We are in a catch-up timeframe right now, working through a large backlog. The forecast we're working through turned out to be inaccurate and not keeping up with the level of demand we have actually realized. The forecast that the plan was built on was initially built 3 years before our current rate case, way back in 2020. You can think about the effects of COVID and what that was doing to the forecasting models. Unfortunately, those forecasts turned out to be wrong because we were just off. And the plans that were built, the resources that were built into that case that were approved by our regulators were not enough to accommodate the demand that we're seeing now. Fortunately, we're actually seeing that rebound effect post-COVID. We're seeing businesses come back. We're seeing communities come back to life. That's the good news story. But we are working through that historical backlog where we just have not had enough resources to accommodate that demand. Some really good news just came out recently. Just a couple weeks ago, the CPUC finalized a rulemaking that actually establishes timelines, but more importantly, really frees up the resources and provides policy support to get through energization timelines for new customer jobs and larger capacity jobs. This rulemaking that came out of legislation called Powering Up Californians Act, a combination of AB 50 and SB 410. A couple weeks ago, the commission finalized the rulemaking on establishing those energization timelines. That's going to force some accountability on us as the utility to make those happen. And if we're successful at achieving those timelines, it's estimated that we'll be able to improve energization timelines by around 50%. That's really good news, and that's coming soon. But in the meantime, we do have to work through this backlog where the forecast was just off, and we continue to work through it. The recent passage of SB 410 did free up a fair amount of resources, actually $2.3 billion for 2025 and 2026 to help us get through that backlog, knowing that the forecast was wrong. That will help as well. And as we build out the process and resources to hit these new timelines, that'll be a really beneficial thing for both us and for all of our customers and the economy, to your point.
That's great to hear, because I've been in a lot of meetings with economic development managers and city managers, and they've shared a frustration over a restaurant that can't connect to power. And what you're saying is, yes, that's taken too long. There's this COVID backlog and stuff that's still happening, but moving forward into 2025, that should take half as much time as it's taking now, right? Whether it's housing or a restaurant or what.
I think that's generally fair. The funding that was created through SB 410 is to allow us to play some catch up over 2025 and 2026. And then we do need to do some process reengineering and really bring on the resources to ultimately hit the timelines. They established average timelines and then a maximum timeline for various types of projects, depending on the complexity. As we hit those average timelines, that's when the overall time to energization is expected to drop by as much as 50%. That'll take a little bit of time to make those improvements, but the funding will pay immediate dividends. Just this year, in 2024, we're planning to bring in around 1,000 jobs, construction ready, that have cleared all of the various dependencies, permitting, et cetera, that they need to go through. But for customers that are ready to go this year, who have been waiting, this funding will allow us to pull them in, ideally by the end of this year.
I think that will make a lot of people happy to hear, and I'm glad we're telling that story. Can you talk about those time frames and what they might be for somebody, just as an example?
I'm recalling these off the top of my head, so don't hold me to these exactly. It depends on the complexity. A really small job like a panel upgrade, I believe, was as short as a month. Service upgrades and distribution upgrades were more like 6 months. And then as you get into big reconductoring projects or substation builds, it's several years.
I think that's helpful as we try to build more housing throughout your territory. If you can give us more information, we'll link to that in the show notes and in the blog for people to read more. Talk about the peak demand and how you're managing that, especially with the onslaught of EVs that are coming and everything else. I think that would just be good to dive in a little bit more, and then we can pivot into climate change.
Sure. We're forecasting 70% load growth by 2040, but 15 to 20% peak demand growth. The interesting thing is that load growth will require investment in the grid. Current grid utilization varies by hour, but on average, it's between 45 and 50%. There's a tremendous opportunity to improve grid utilization through flexible load, through load shifting, through advanced load management strategies, which will help alleviate that pressure on grid investment and accommodate that load growth. Just think about how much more we could be putting through the existing wires. And that's one of our main focus areas, is how do we improve that utilization? We do have some localized capacity constraints, but on the whole, grid utilization is hovering around that 50% mark. It becomes more of a timing issue over the course of the day. If we can shift that load from peak periods to fill up that midday, the belly of the duck on that duck curve, and push that utilization higher than 45 to 50%, that's a win. That's where the importance of storage, both behind the meter retail scale storage, but also utility scale storage, that storage is really the silver bullet here to allow us to do load shifting, along with the combination of technology and policy advancements. Technology that will allow seamless home energy, building energy management without customers having to think about that at all. That is already starting to show up, but is coming on strong. If we can couple that with policy change, especially pricing policy, by the 2028 to 2030 timeframe, the state is keen on moving towards a dynamic pricing model for energy. If we can pair that move to dynamic pricing with technology that can ingest that pricing in a seamless way and not have to have customers programming everything and programming every little device, that, and of course, pair that with more and more storage on the system, fill up the belly of the duck, manage that peak. That is a winning combination for increasing that grid utilization in a cost-effective way. And again, getting our system to a more resilient, more reliable place, but also continuing to manage that unit cost of energy.
Well, then I just had MCE on talking about peak demand and managing that. One of the interesting things is, right, it's really easy for me to set a pool pump. I don't think I've touched it in 3 years to end by 3:45. So from that 4 to 9 p.m., it's not running during those peak hours. I'm okay if I fill up the dishwasher at 5 o'clock or 8 o'clock. I set it has this easy delayed timer start feature, and I don't let mine go off before 12 or 1 in the morning. But it has to be easier for people. Talk about how for homeowners, but then on the grid, you're embracing new technology, smart tools, and various things like that.
Yeah, we touched on AI earlier. AI is a driver of significant expected load growth, but AI is also a valuable tool for helping manage that load flexibility on the grid. We are using AI in a number of applications. In terms of innovation, we have AI built into our contact center calls with customers. We have AI built into our predictive maintenance modeling, taking multiple pieces of data and helping us figure out when is that transformer expected to fail, and let's get ahead of that with predictive maintenance. That's another application of AI. We have it built into our high definition weather cameras to detect and spot pluming and smoke for potential wildfires. We just launched a new outage notification platform, which has AI and machine learning built into we call it smart comms, but it's an outage notification platform that looks at multiple pieces of data, the type of outage, the location of the outage, maybe the type of equipment that failed, where it's located, and provides an automated estimated time of restoration within 5 to 10 minutes of that outage, built on machine learning. Whereas in the past, it would have been much more of a guess. That's learning over time and providing more accurate, automated, estimated times of restoration before we even get a troubleshooter out there to assess the outage and figure out what's really going on. AI in use across the board in multiple applications. We have, speaking of managing peak demand, last year we had really a first of its kind and largest ever peak power shaving virtual power plant. This was a program in the summer over the hot months of the year, August through October, from 7 to 9 p.m. every day. We had essentially, like I said, a summer peaking shaving BPP where all the customers that were enrolled, around 35 megawatts, would discharge these batteries between 7 and 9 p.m. and alleviate some of the stress on the grid. Innovation in a number of ways. I think that's an example of a type of virtual power plant and really leveraging the proliferation of storage, which we need to continue building upon, that is going to help manage that peak long term. And again, manage what we need to invest into the grid and create that resilient system that supports that clean energy transition.
And that's what Kevin Matthews from First Student talked about in a VPP format. If you can have 300 school buses in one lot from 5 or 6 school districts that they all park in one place, they could dump their batteries out between 7 and 9 p.m. and then recharge at midnight. They could help be a resource of using batteries in different ways.
Exactly. That's exactly right. And EVs, those are batteries on wheels. I think the average EV has something like 5 or 6 times the capacity of a Tesla Powerwall. And it's potentially, especially in the example of a school bus fleet, very flexible load that can be managed and discharged at the right times. Again, that's where the importance of emerging energy management technology platforms and systems, home energy management, building energy management, especially on more industrial scale sites. That's where the emergence of that kind of technology is going to be really important for managing the peak, and the use of AI is going to be critical for that, in making sure that we can do all of this at a cost that's sustainable to all of us as customers.
And I grabbed the AI stats real quick. When you type into Google and it says, and it has the first one now as an AI search, that's the equivalent of plugging in an iPhone from 0% to 100% in terms of a power use. And a typical chat GBT write-up is 4 light bulbs for 30 minutes.
Wow.
Very power hungry devices we use here. Can't look at PG&E and Northern California and not talk about wildfire and safety. Talk about how the organization has learned from the past couple of years. What are you doing to build for the future, and how we're keeping everybody safe together?
Certainly, one of our highest priority focus areas for the last several years is layers of protection for wildfire risk. It starts with the preventative maintenance work and the capital investment work we're doing on the grids. Preventative maintenance work in the form of inspections, multiple types of system inspections. We've now deployed since about 2020. We've been using drones to perform different types of system inspections. It's proven very helpful. AI is used in that process as well. Really ramped up our inspection processes over the last several years. On the maintenance side, a lot of people have heard about the targeted undergrounding programs. Undergrounding our riskiest lines. It's about 8% of our most risky lines, usually in heavily vegetated areas, is a more cost-effective way to almost permanently reduce or completely reduce the wildfire risk related to those assets. And then doing a fair amount of system hardening work. That's the stronger poles. That's the covered conductor. Sometimes you hear it referred to as tree wire. In the East Bay, we're doing a little bit of undergrounding, about 2 miles in the Berkeley Hills area, and a fair amount of system hardening over the next couple of years. 35 miles of system hardening work in the East Bay community specifically, primarily focused in the Clayton and Antioch, Pittsburgh areas. Those are some of our highest risk areas from a wildfire perspective in Alameda and Contra Costa County. That's the maintenance and then the capital work. And of course, situational awareness, really important. That's another layer of those layers of protection. That's our weather stations. We have hundreds of weather stations, which can all be publicly accessed via our website. It's a cool thing to see, as well as our HD cameras, also publicly accessible via our website. Good coverage throughout our service territory of high definition cameras, which can spot wildfires developing. That's really our situational awareness, as well as a detailed look ahead from a meteorology perspective. We're looking at like gigabytes and gigabytes of data every single day, down to a 2-kilometer square, evaluating wind speed, moisture levels, residual humidity, dry fuels, live fuels, dead fuels, you name it. It's a very sophisticated weather model that predicts wildfire activity or wildfire risk. That's many aspects of our situational awareness. And then you get finally into kind of the last resort layers of protection, the wildfire safety outage. Those are things like enhanced power line safety settings, or EPSS, where the power is being cut off within 1/10 of a second in wildfire risky areas. Those circuits are enabled with devices that can cut off power in a fraction of a second. And then, of course, we've all heard in the past about PSPS, public safety power shutoffs, which are really that last resort in the worst wildfire risk conditions, red flag warning days, really high predicted wind speeds, where we are confident that something is going to get into our lines and potentially cause an ignition. PSPS serves as a last resort. Multiple ways we're tackling that. The risk has been reduced significantly over the last few years. EPSS alone has reduced wildfire risk by about 72% on our system relative to the 2018 through 2020 period.
70% in 5 years. That's a big accomplishment. I know most people don't appreciate that because they don't see it. They just remember the past, or the one in the 30% that's going to possibly come, they're still hearing. What do you want people to know in the years ahead about the wildfires, and what should people continue to do or pay attention to related to PG&E in particular? Maybe from an emergency management standpoint. Or
I would want people to take away that wildfire risk is unlikely to be going away anytime soon. It's probably getting worse with the impacts of climate change. We are further ahead of that wildfire risk than we've ever been. The system is safer today than it was yesterday because of all of those different layers of protection. I would really encourage all of our customers and communities to have their own plan. Have a plan for defensible space around your house or your business. Have an exit plan, have an emergency plan. Drill that with your family. Have a go bag ready to go with supplies, water, food, and important drugs you might need. We feel like we are doing everything we possibly can and are invested in mitigating wildfire risk. Vegetation management is another big thing. We spend over $1.5 billion on vegetation management, the largest, if not the world, program managing vegetation. We are working very hard at that. I would just ask our customers and communities to understand that we will not compromise on safety. That will always be our highest priority. Sometimes that does have an impact on local reliability when we have wildfire safety outages, which is why it's important for everyone to have a plan for themselves as well.
Let's pivot that into climate change, and also part of that is resiliency, which we've touched on a little bit. But PG&E is actually one of the leading utilities in the country at changing their energy portfolio into renewables. Talk about what is the company doing to continue to lead and respond to climate change and move in a good direction.
Yeah, so I think it's SB 100 that establishes some of those goals. We feel like we're in a pretty good place to meet those near term. Longer term, 2040, that's a challenge, not just for us, but for the whole state. There is going to have to be more development of renewable resources in a faster way to meet those 2040 goals. We feel like we have been a leading player in this space for many years, hitting our RPS targets. I think there was a day last summer where our entire customer population was served by GHG-free energy, which is pretty remarkable. And we were able to export to other parts of the Western grid, supporting our neighbors in the West. We feel like we're on track to do that and have been a leader in the space for quite some time.
What are some of the developments into that? I know there's talk about wave power, offshore wind to get to bigger fields, more solar in the desert. What are some paths that PG&E is looking at?
I think all of the above are going to be important. Our role in that is really to make sure that the grid is well positioned to interconnect those generating assets. The one area where we might be more focused is on battery storage. We're certainly continuing to grow our fleet of utility scale storage. We just brought a big one online in the last couple of years at Elkhorn Slough near Moss Landing. I think if anything, we will likely focus in that storage space and continue to expand in the utility scale batteries. Offshore wind, new solar developments, community solar, those are all very important things that developers will be working on. And then our role will be to make sure that we're well positioned to interconnect them to the grid.
I got to ask about resilience here. What are we doing to prepare for resiliency amongst wildfires, earthquakes, mudslides, et cetera, that do impact California?
Yeah, it's important to note that in some of our larger, more impactful PSPS events in the past, we have experienced hurricane force level winds. We have seen 100-mile-per-hour plus wind gusts impacting our facilities. It is very real here in California. One of the keys is ensuring that our design standards are aligned with the realities of those climate impacts. Are we designing and installing new poles that are of the required strength and with a margin to deal with those new realities of those wind speeds? Are we designing power lines with covered conductor in certain areas so that line slap in wind doesn't cause an outage, or vegetation getting into the lines doesn't cause an outage when we know debris is going to be flying around everywhere? I think a big part of this comes back to design. Another key piece is, are we appropriately sizing our equipment and our transformers? With climate change, temperatures have risen. And so we've seen communities that used to be rated as a coastal climate, but have gotten hotter over the last several years. We need to make sure that our transformer designs, as an example, or transformer sizing, aligns with that new climate reality and is not necessarily tagged as a coastal climate, but understand this community has now gotten hotter. It's expected to stay hot. These transformers, as we replace them and rebuild the grid in this area, need to be upsized. We can't just build the same old grid, right? It's got to be properly designed to reinforce standards that match with the realities of climate. A lot of it comes back to design. Another big piece is preparedness, like I talked about, encouraging our customers and communities to have a plan. We have a plan. We exercise that plan regularly. We run numerous emergency drills over the course of the year. In fact, we just practiced one in Contra Costa a couple of weeks ago. It was a live action drill with multiple first responder agencies. Contra Costa Fire was there. Concord Fire was there. Contra Costa Fire Protection District was there. Concord PD was there. Multiple EMTs. We had 3 active fires happening at once. It was a simulated earthquake where we know that we as PG&E are going to have to work side by side with all these first responder agencies to respond to this event. The car had severed a gas riser and there was a fire there, gas leaking into a home. There was a downed power line. There was another ruptured gas pipeline. We practice this kind of stuff all the time, whether it's a simulated earthquake, a wildfire drill, a PSPS, or even a cyber attack on our energy grid. We are constantly drilling on these things, both internally and with relevant agencies and partner organizations.
That's helpful to know and just gives people an idea how hard PG&E is working. Anything else that you want to share about some of the work you guys are doing, particularly here in the East Bay?
One of the things that I'm particularly proud of is the community and involvement and engagement of PG&Eers throughout the system, but certainly in the East Bay community. I think last year, the PG&E Foundation, from a charitable perspective, gave about $3.5 million to over 150 organizations throughout the East Bay, throughout Contra Costa, Alameda, and actually Solano County. System-wide, we had over 200 plus volunteer events, 35,000 plus employee volunteer hours. Our employees personally gave over $3 million to organizations that mattered to them. I think I would just reinforce the point that we're working hard on a number of different fronts: electric reliability, to resiliency, to dealing with climate change, to trying to manage customers' bills and improve affordability. But ultimately, PG&E is full of really good people who are your friends, your neighbors, your family, who really care and are deeply invested in their communities.
That's a great note to end on, Jake. Ziggleman, I appreciate you being here from PG&E and talking about the future of our energy here in the East Bay. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Wait, don't leave yet. Hit subscribe. Make sure you get the weekly updates. We have a new episode every Wednesday for stuff happening in the East Bay. In the meantime, follow me on LinkedIn, Jared Asch, or check out our firm where we have a weekly newsletter and blog at Capstone Government Affairs on LinkedIn. Thanks for joining us today on the Capstone Conversation.